Good morning and welcome to the ECA webinar on the materials shortage and managing contractual risks. My name is Rob Driscoll, the Director of Legal and Business at ECA, and welcoming and joining me today here is Ruth Wilkinson of Hill Dickinson Law Firm. Ruth, would you like to say hello?
Yeah, hello everybody, and thank you for asking me to join you today, Rob. I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say, and I'm looking forward to giving an overview of the JCT and the NEC and how they deal with issues relating to material unavailability.
As everybody knows, it's been a pretty bumpy ride through 2021, and as we head into 2022, right now it seems like restrictions are easing. But what we've also got to work out is what's going to happen in our industry. I wanted to remind people of the data towards the end of 2021 and what the scenario looked like for the engineering services market, and specifically the electrotechnical trade. So here we have a bunch of logos for manufacturers and wholesalers. The ECA works closely with the EDA, which is the Electrical Distributors Association, and we share data with each other. And thanks to the EDA team, who share 85 businesses responses representing 800 or over 1,000 branches of wholesalers, and equally manufacturers, 45 businesses. That's a huge response rate to their intelligence survey about what's happening in the market. As I say, I wanted to remind you of what was going on. Demand was starting to peak in 2021 and then started to pale off in the latter half of 2021. So what we saw was an increased infrastructure pipeline from the public sector, which had kind of kept the levelling up agenda moving forward and kept the economy buoyant. As businesses started to pivot and retail and hospitality still suffered, there wasn't necessarily a bounce back in the same way in some of those sectors. And as restrictions eased over the summer before the Omicron variant, the private housing sector also saw things petering off as people moved their savings back towards holidays and other breaks. So having a look at this graph on the right-hand side there, you'll see the very top is infrastructure, which kept on going. Then you see private housing starting to dip and other areas. Although there were some signs with things like industrial, warehousing, commercial, logistics, as some businesses pivoted to online, that work was still buoyant. So, other things I'd like to remind you of is inflation was an all-time high at the end of last year. Particularly, though, the construction press was focusing on what they called bricks and sticks. So, large-scale, high-volume aggregates, stemming from the ability of the industry to build, which did mean that, unfortunately, some of the media spotlight wasn't necessarily on the engineering services sector. What I would say at the end of 2021, moving into 2022, is that currently, because the inflationary pressures on wood, timber, bricks and other aggregates has calmed down a bit, and supply has leveled off to a certain extent, there has been slightly more focus on plastic, silicon chips and other issues and components which are involved in the M&E market. Now, together with that, I was going to remind you that freight had gone through the roof, to put it bluntly. So what we had was an 88% rise in the cost of containers. We had freight stuck in the wrong parts of the world. So they were moving transportation capacity back to the Asia Pacific from the Americas. And that moved up costs simply because there wasn't the supply required. You also had businesses around the world, remembering that we're competing with other sectors for that freight. You had businesses like IKEA taking evasive steps to ensure their supply lines, like chartering ships and buying containers themselves to get their supplies in the right place at the right time. So contracted allocations were restricted. So as I say, freight had gone up. Although on the right-hand side there you see it did come down at some point, it was by no means down to what it was. And I don't think it will be as we move through 2022. I also wanted to remind people that the fuel crisis is really beyond the week of media around petrol prices at the pumps and lack of availability, which may have since dissipated, has steadily crept up and up and up. And of course, last year we had COP26 focusing on green energy, but that also puts a pressure on fossil fuels, as well as the energy crisis that we saw with the cap on prices being removed by the UK government. So we have a scenario where there are a series of issues pushing up inflation globally, including a shortage of raw materials, and we had UK Steel last year having to close their order book. What we've got here is, according to EDA data, nearly 70% of all respondents saying the minimum inflation they were expecting on electrotechnical goods was 10% or higher. But even of the remaining 30-odd%, you had 5 to 9%. That's extraordinarily high. There's a small breakdown they gave us of goods and lead times, because just-in-time delivery or expecting it to be there when you turn up at the trade counter was no longer an option. We also saw hardening of commercial behaviour around specific products, and some drilling down into lead times and what they thought the pressures would be. Finally, I just wanted to kind of introduce a context before Ruth gives you the real practical, useful stuff. Far be it from me to just hypothesize based on what's happening in the economy. And the CLC, the Construction Leadership Council, which is the conduit between industry and government, did put a kind of political flag in the ground middle of last year, where it really did encourage industry to share and collaborate on the risk of this. And I'd also remind people at this stage that if anybody's listening back to this from Northern Ireland, Wales, there are public procurement notes in place within those devolved governments, which equally encourage the parties to share the risk. So in England only there isn't one, but the CLC did come out and ask people to use the existing contractual options to collaborate. Remembering that with COVID, there were no contractual clauses that dealt with COVID. With the variation, let's say variable price of materials, there are options. Now, having said that, I'm going to introduce Ruth again and let her take over. And if you want me to move you on through the slides, just say.
Okay, thank you very much, Rob. If you can move me on to my kind of first cover slide, that would be great. Thank you. So, I mean, I think Rob has outlined what the kind of issue is from a practical and a commercial sense, and I suppose my kind of job and Rob's job also is to, you know, how do we help contractors and subcontractors in particular deal with this issue, and how do we help them, enable them to resolve commercially and contractually the risks associated with materials and availability and increasing costs. And of course, the risks mainly are increased cost of the project, and also delays to that project, and whether or not they can get any recovery under existing and new contracts. So if we move to the next slide, we're going to start with the position under the JCT contract, specifically the JCT Design and Build 2016. So under this form of main contract, the starting point is that the contractor carries out work for an agreed price by reference to usually the employer's requirements, or, you know, it might be the contractor's proposals, but they're effectively the specification. The position is usually that a contractor can't recover more time or more money unless it's in accordance with the express terms of the contract. So we focus particularly on what the contract says about the materials that ought to be used, and also entitlement to time and money. So clause 2.21 states that all materials and goods for the work shall, and I've highlighted so far as procurable, be of the kinds and standards described in the employer's requirements ... Now, some focus has been given onto what these words actually mean. So is it, for example, are those materials not procurable if they're not procurable at a certain time or within a certain time frame? Or actually what you need here, is it for them to be totally unavailable, totally unprocurable? And I would suspect that it would be a question of fact and degree in each case. This clause also goes on to clarify that the employer's consent is needed to substitute materials. And if, of course, the employer does that, then that would likely to be a variation to the works. Now, Clause 2.21 needs to be read in conjunction with Clause 2.3, which is an obligation on the contractor to proceed regularly and diligently with the works, which is likely to be interpreted as a requirement on the contractor to investigate alternative procurement routes and possibly sequencing also. So when the contractor is looking to get further time or money under the JCT contract, then it needs to look specifically at the provisions relating to relevant events and relevant matters. So relevant events are those events that entitle you to potentially recover additional time, so as to get an extension to the completion date and therefore not be liable to the employer for usually liquidated damages that are stated in the contract. There's a number of relevant events that are listed. Some of these are neutral events, so items such as weather or delays by statutory undertakers. Some of these are events, culpable events, where the employer or the employer is at fault. So, for example, that the employer may delay issue an instruction to postpone the works, the commencement of the works. There may be a variation or a change to the works, an act of prevention, etc. The provisions that relate to the relevant events need to be reviewed carefully. Notices are required to be given by the contractor as soon as it becomes reasonably apparent that there's going to be a delay to the completion date. And my recommendation would be that when you are considering the factual circumstances that are resulting in the delay that you are seeing to the works, you need to consider carefully which of those grounds are relevant. I've highlighted in this slide some possible ones that might relate specifically to materials unavailability, and these include, for example, whether there has been a change to the works instructed by the employer's agent. And I say this because the employer's agent has an obligation to proactively manage the contract, and it might be that with discussion with the contractor and the employer, it might be prudent for there to be an instruction to substitute materials, which the employer is able to do, and that might entitle the contractor to an extension of time. I've also flagged on here reference to force majeure. This is one of the neutral events that I mentioned, so it's not the fault of either the contractor or the employer. Force majeure isn't usually defined in the JCT contract, but it is usually taken to mean an exceptional event that's beyond the control of either party, makes performance impossible. Whether or not this clause will apply will depend very much on when the contract was entered into. So, for example, if the delay to the materials is due to Brexit or COVID, it will depend whether the contract was entered into before either of those events happened. So we're talking about possibly contracts before 2020, which I suspect may be unlikely to be the case with some of the contracts that we are dealing with now. Force majeure is unlikely to bite when it relates to unavailability of materials, which makes it either more difficult or more expensive to carry out the works. When the employer is, of course, if you're looking for getting additional money, then you need to look at the list of relevant matters that's in clause 420. The list of relevant matters, there's a separate notice provision that needs to be applied here, that you have to give notice to the employer, and the list of relevant matters is significantly shorter than the list of relevant events. And it doesn't include force majeure, which we've just talked about, but it does include items such as employer's default and changes to the works. I would flag that it's very common for the list of relevant events and relevant matters to be amended by a schedule of amendments. So when you are checking your contract, you should specifically check whether any changes have been made. So if we could move, Rob, to the next slide. So looking instead at the position under the NEC4 engineering and construction contract. Under this contract, all of the obligations are underpinned by the principle of mutual trust and cooperation, which is an obligation on the parties, the project manager and the supervisor, to act in this way. And I suspect that this will be at the fore of any claims for materials in relation to materials unavailability and delays. When a contractor wishes to get additional time or additional money under the NEC form of contract, then you look at the compensation events provisions that are in clause 60. And again, very similar to the JCT form, there are a list of specific events that may entitle you to additional time or money. And I've highlighted on the slide there a couple that may be relevant here. So for example, one is where a project manager gives an instruction which results in a change in scope of the works. And this, of course, may arise if materials become unavailable and therefore there needs to be amendments to accommodate that. There's also a separate basis for a compensation event where a project manager gives an instruction to stop or to not start the works or to change a key date. I've flagged up also prevention. There's no concept of, well, there's no reference to force majeure in the NEC form of contract, but this is a force majeure type provision. And this applies where something happens which affects the whole of the works that neither party can prevent, and an experienced contractor would have judged to have had a very small chance of occurring as at outset. It's an objective test. I think on balance it's maybe unlikely to apply in relation to the increased cost of materials, depending on the factual circumstances. So again, we go back to the timing of when the contract was entered into. There's also in the context of compensation events, I would flag clause 17.2, and this is where the project manager or the contractor have to notify the other if they become aware of a requirement that becomes illegal or impossible to carry out. That's a requirement in the scope, and that may result in an instruction which of itself may entitle the contractor to a compensation event. One thing to flag in relation to the NEC form of contract, where it's a bit different to the JCT, is in relation to the early warning provisions, the risk register, and the notices, the nature of the notices. It's imperative that the contractors comply with those provisions. They need to give early warning of any issues including in relation to materials unavailability. That can then be recorded in the risk register, and then subsequently notices given in the event of delay. A compensation event needs to be noticed within 8 weeks, or else the entitlement to a compensation event may be lost in its entirety. If we can move to the next slide. So Robert asked me specifically to look briefly at fluctuation clauses in the context of the JCT and the NEC, which is why I've brought them out together and compared them in this chart. So fluctuation clauses are intended to deal with inflation, the effects of inflation, which we are going to see significantly this year. The risk for the contractor is, unless the contract makes specific provision for the effect of inflation, then they will usually take that risk in the price that they have agreed. The JCT design and build is usually a fixed price contract, and as I said right at the outset, can only really be amended in accordance with the terms of the contract. So, for example, if there's a variation to the works, etc. Whereas there are various pricing options that can be used in the NEC form of contract, including fixed, target, and reimbursable. So there's some more options in that regard. The JCT contract, however, does make provision for 3 fluctuations, and these can be incorporated as an option into the JCT contract. Over my years of practice, I haven't seen fluctuations being applied in any of the contracts that I have dealt with, and in fact, over the last year or so, as this issue has become increasingly an increasing challenge for contractors, I haven't seen a change in that practice. In fact, there continues to be a resistance to including fluctuations into contracts, and that I think is driven by the uncertainty that's passed on to the employer and the funder. What I am seeing, however, in relation to the JCT design and build contract is a willingness in some circumstances for the contractor and employer to agree bespoke clauses to be inserted into the JCT schedule of amendments, setting out in relation to particular materials allowance for increased prices to be taken into account, and also the effect of increased lead-in times. and it depends on the bargaining position of the respective parties. In relation to the NEC4 contract, of course, going back to that, there is also an option, secondary option X1, which allows for a price adjustment for inflation, and this can be completed by the parties. I have seen this more commonly included, and the effect of this will depend very much on which indices are being selected, and this is something you'll need to discuss with your quantity surveyor or other advisors. There's also a provision in the NEC contract for a change in law, so secondary option X2. However, I would note that the change in law would only applies to the country in which the site is located. So if you have an issue that goods or materials are being delayed from another country because of a change in law over there, that particular clause won't bite in those circumstances. If you could move to the final slide in this section. So I wanted to try and finish off with a few top tips, quite brief ones in these circumstances. And the first one, in kind of the mantra of lawyers across the country and across the world, no doubt, is to understand your contracts. In relation to existing contracts, make sure that you review them carefully to understand what in what circumstances you're entitled to additional time and money, and importantly, whether you need to give specific notice and if there are any restrictions on those, or if they're drafted as condition precedent, which means that if you fail to give notice within a particular period, you lose your entitlements. Looking to new contracts, and this is jumping forward to one of the other points on the slide, you should consider the practical circumstances that you are facing when you enter into that contract, and consider making express provision for those. The standard forms were, drafted many years ago and not designed necessarily to deal with the circumstances that we find ourselves in now. And I am seeing increasingly in schedule of amendments clauses dealing with the effect of COVID, clauses relating to pandemics defining force majeure, and also specifically provisions relating to material shortages and delays and the impact of those, entitling the contractor sometimes to time and money, and potentially entitling the contractor to recover an increase in the prices. But these are matters that need to be specifically discussed and negotiated. Records, yet again, another mantra that's worth repeating. It's really important because you need to evidence your position in order to support and substantiate your claim. So, the evidence that I'm talking about in relation to materials unavailability will be things such as the original quotations, any amendments to those quotations, correspondence with suppliers about delays to those materials, etc., and keep them in a good and organised fashion. Give the notices when required, so work out what the notices are and make sure that you give them in a timely fashion in accordance with the provisions of the contract. And finally, communication, and I know that we'll probably go on to discuss this with Rob a little bit more, but the key to this is, full and kind of frank discussion with the employer about the issues that are facing you in relation to this, so that they can understand what the issue is, so that you can try and find a commercial resolution to this, to the issue, which may include being able to agree amendments to the contract, either in the form of a schedule of amendments at the outset, or potentially, and perhaps unlikely, in a variation to an existing contract. Thank you very much, Rob. That kind of concludes my kind of formal section, so to speak.
Right, thank you, Ruth. I just wanted to cover a couple of issues and draw out a few points from Ruth's presentation there, which I think was incredibly useful. Commercially, if we step back from the law and the contracts, one of the points that emerged from Ruth's presentation there is the need to have the conversation early. Don't have it in the moment. What Ruth was outlining there is how to operate the contractual machinery, whether it be JCT or NEC, when you have to have the conversation in the moment, notices, issuing things, making sure you've got relevant events, relevant matters, compensation events that back you up. The ideal point is that commercially, if there is an abundance of work around in the market, which is what I was describing in 2021, and hopefully that will sustain us even with a little bit of a tail off into 2022, we have demand. we have a number of tenders floating around in the market which are available for you to bid on. But as always, when you come out of an economic crash, there is a tendency to overeat. We know that insolvency figures are on the rise, and that's probably put down to, in shorthand, the withdrawal of the government COVID support measures, but it can also be for other issues. So if you go out there at the moment as contractors, take all the tenders, fixed price lump sum scenarios, yet your costs are rising through the roof, not just because of materials, because we also know there's inflation in the labour market, and CPI in the mainstream economy is riding at something like 5 to 6% at the moment. We've got a scenario whereby you're potentially buying work today and you cannot guarantee that you will be able to deliver it at any profit or even cost when it comes to delivery tomorrow. So be careful that you're not buying a problem. I think people need to, when they're looking at individual tenders, look at how long the job runs for, length of program, when it will take them up to, how long they're bidding now for. We've had scenarios where people are bidding now for a job that won't even start for 6 months and then will run for 12 to 18 months. That means those prices are 2 years out. But when it comes to the final stage of delivery, I guess you do need to think contractually about pushing back on certain items, because if you can't get those, you're going to also be penalised for late delivery in terms of LADs. Is a tip from me. We have had experience on my help desk for the 2,700 members of ECA, whereby people are getting advanced payments for some materials, which matches up with Ruth's experience, and coupling that up with a vesting certificate, which simply is a legal document saying it belongs to you, you paid me for it, it's insured, it's labelled yours, and if I go bust, it belongs to you. Some are saying, well, you know what, the profit on the materials isn't worth the risk, so we will ask for them to free issue it to us. Others may be in a scenario, depending on the materials, to get some stockpiling in place, and then you have the contractual issues there. But I guess my experience as well matches with Ruth's. That I was just considering the other day that I think I'm clocking up 20 years as a qualified legal practitioner this year. I've never seen fluctuations used, but what I have seen in the last 6 months for the first time ever is a swathe of contractors stepping away from guaranteeing price on everything and carving out the price on certain materials to say this has to fluctuate, because even in a 30-day validity of a quote scenario, certain items may have gone up 3, 4, 5, 600%. So bear in mind all those considerations as you head through the initial stages of 2022 and beyond. I'm going to ask Ruth to give her key 2 takeaways in a second, but I'd also ask you to think right up to the end of 2022. This could be a bumpy ride, not just for the reasons we've explained, but you will also remember that at the end of 2022, beginning of 23, starts UKCA marking, whereby the products you are contracted to supply and install will have to be UKCA marked to be valid, and the UK will no longer accept CE marked. So bear that in mind as well, because there is reduced testing house capacity to get all of the products we have currently in the moment tested and approved to be UKCA marked. And currently there's a bit of a standoff, I think, between industry and government, and government is still leaving a cliff edge drop for us. So, Ruth, before we go, your 2 key takeaways.
So I suppose the first one is kind of ties back to the communication point, which I think is key, and is to emphasize that I think you need on every project to identify what you think the key risks are and think about how best to deal with those risks. And this particular talks about materials unavailability, so that is the risk that we're talking about today. And I think what both you and I have done today is to try and outline some of the ways that those risks can be managed and mitigated. But I think you can't expect the employer to know what those risks are, or to anticipate what might help you. So I think you need to quite simply ask for it, ask for it straight out. And you know, there are options such as these bespoke provisions that Rob and I have spoken about, where particular materials may be able to carve out, and you may be able to have the benefit of increases on those particular points. The second takeaway from this is that I didn't have a chance to mention this in my kind of initial presentation, but we are seeing an increase in parties using letters of intent and possibly pre-contractual services agreements in order to accommodate the early order of materials. And I think, whilst I think that mechanism can work in order to do that, I would just caution people from using those documents, because they're unlikely to be as robust as a full contract. And I would suggest that you get legal advice on those and the effect of those. And if you do enter into a letter of intent, make sure that you don't forget to continue with the negotiations on the main contract and get that in place.
Thank you very much, Ruth. So that's Ruth Wilkinson from Hill Dickinson and Rob Driscoll from ECA. So thank you very much, and goodbye.